How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, good. I guess picking it up from where we just left
Where
off.
we just left off.
Yeah. And,
Okay.
And what we were thinking about was, hey, what if we had these conversations, right, with people?
Mm-hmm.
And let's start with ourselves. I mean, what we're looking to do is have these conversations about how we have gone through our experiences and all the things that we've learned. But the difference is that while we continue to grow and thrive in our state that we're in right now, we're also very aware that, you know what, as much as we got through that, we could face it the next minute. And so when we look at and try to talk to people and have conversations with them about what they did right,
Mm-hmm.
there's this assumption in there that I think we want to really take a closer look at, which I think I disagree with which it's a misconception.
Yeah.
That because they've been through it, they now are not vulnerable anymore, and that they know everything.
You got Teflon covering
and they're
them.
enlightened. Whereas in fact, the truth is a much more humble state, right? And with knowing that, with expressing it that way, perhaps the people that seem to be stuck at these points realize that, really, those people aren't that special. I think that's a big piece that's missing.
It's a huge piece that's missing, because I feel we're socialized to not view ourselves as powerful as we actually are,
right,
and harness our own internal capacity to thrive and our strength. We're always told we have to look for it externally,
Yeah, I always used to feel when I was kind of like at that point, at those lower points, those earlier stages, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I would look up to somewhere or someone or some discussion, there was this gap kind of that I felt existed. It was like there was no bridge for that. And I was like, I guess I don't have that talent, or I don't have that know-how, or I'm not that skilled, or worthy, or whatever, right? Call it the fear. Call it the fear of success itself.
Yeah.
Right? Until I came to realize that actually I'm not different. I'm not very different from these ones.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I thought this, or I was taught this, was because, again, there was this fallacy that they did everything right. They never did anything wrong.
They had opportunities and support I didn't have.
Correct. And as a result, or they're more special in some ways, and something's wrong with me. And you see how, and it does just
the self-defecating kind of narrative buries people down.
Right.
Yeah.
So we could actually talk through something like that, where we've actually had experiences, where we've had that same, what did you call it?
Self-responsibility.
Right. But what were we doing to ourselves when we were in that
self-defecating,
mode?
yeah.
Right. So when we start doing that to ourselves, you've done it, I've done it. And sometimes we've learned to do it. Right.
And you manifest more of the same when you do that too.
Right. So I would love to take a closer look at that.
Mm-hmm.
I do it sometimes just out of conversation when we're talking to people about, hey, don't worry, I did this.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then this is what I learned.
Yeah.
And
the humility of it is not known, right? So I haven't really been well versed in watching people who've achieved great success or reading biographies. It just hasn't been a thing for me. But I have seen some of them, and I do, it's a lot of bravado, I find, right? There's some good tools and good information there, don't get me wrong, but it's a lot of bravado. And it's the humility that people need. Because the humility is the baseline for everyone's connection, right? Humility is the baseline for everyone's strength. Because when you can be humble and look at yourself objectively through the lens of like, oh, I'm really great at this, or I really could improve over here, sitting with that neutrality lets you know that you're always in a perpetual state of learning and creating, right? And so
and then that gap doesn't look so big.
The gap does, and this is the thing, it's going to ebb and flow, right? You're going to gather your strength and your skills, and you're going to excel in this little pond you're in, and then guess what? You're going to jump into a lake, and all of a sudden you're like, oh no, it's so much bigger. I can't swim across this lake. It's huge. I'm used to my little pond. But what people forget is that the strength you have in the pond is still there and just as vigorous in the lake. It just looks differently now because you're swimming in new waters. And again, you're going to acclimate and you're going to build and you're going to strengthen. Then you're going to go to an ocean. And that's just the way it goes.
Okay.
But so people get really defeated.
How about we build that bridge, or we get rid of that gap?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah.
How many times has this happened, right? And there's so many examples, right? But one thing that we recently talked about, and hey, you can go or I can go. It doesn't really matter. I feel like either, like we help each other.
Yeah.
And that's the point of this specific conversation, is that I feel I've been through those kind of moments where there's a lot of self-doubt, and either it's self-inflicted or, we learned it from somewhere.
Or a combination of the both.
Usually it's a combination.
Yeah.
And what happens is it's a creep. I call it creeps in. It's not like the light's on and the light's off.
Yeah.
It just dims
It's a slow
slowly.
drip. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I figured we could start at a certain point where it was dark enough, let's just say, if we're using the analogy of lighting, right? So it was dark enough. And then we realize, oh my God, it's pretty dark. And then from there we start saying, how did it get here? Where did I go wrong? So we start from that moment. We go backwards
of the depth
little bit.
Of the darkness.
Yeah.
Okay.
We get to that point. We're like, okay, it's dark here.
Yeah.
Something's wrong. Something tells us something's wrong. And then we like the why. How did I get here? Why did I get here? And then there's like that analysis that we do, right? And then there's okay, so these are my next steps.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes we do that on our own, and sometimes we get help along the way. So I just thought we could take a look at like any one of those. And you shared like with me this, your own sort of experience that you had. And even though you're a professional in walking people through their own challenges that they have, what I really appreciate about what you have said is that even you as a professional have had to face your own, abyss.
Of course. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
This is the thing. You say like, of course I have. And it's kind of like you wear it like a badge, right?
Yeah.
I look at it like a badge, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Whereas others see it as like this sort of thing that they want to throw away and hide.
Yeah. I see it as I have my BSW, my RSW, my MSW. These are my, my official letters. But then I have all of these other life experiences. Right. That have bequeathed me so much knowledge that if I hadn't gone through that and felt it and moved through it and reconciled and forgiven and incorporated and integrated all of these things, I wouldn't be the letters over here.
Yeah. How could you possibly help them?
Right? So to me, there's a duality there that people need to appreciate. And, I think I was having this conversation. It was with my mom. She was up recently helping me out. And I think we talked about this. I'm not sure, but we were just talking about the different traumas in my life and what's happened. And my parents are just really starting to be aware of this now. Like really, my dad actually texts. He's like, wow, your childhood was really shitty. And I'm like, yeah, it really was. And so when looking at through this conversation with my mom, through the perspective of sexual abuse, she's like, oh God, I wish that just wouldn't have happened. I wish that didn't happen to you. And we could just take that away and then your life would be so much better. And I said, I wouldn't take it away for anything. And she was just so uncomfortable with that statement.
Right.
Because it's taught me so many things about myself. Right. I understand my boundaries. I understand my triggers differently. I understand, my relationship with my body very differently. Right. And then so that it is a personal level, but then also on a professional level, when I was investigating the primary cases I investigate, I had baby cases and sexual abuse cases. Those were my primary cases. And, very early on in my career, like within a year and a half of starting in child welfare, I was testifying in a trial where from a disclosure I received from a child who was sexually assaulted by their father, and he was actually convicted. Like that is not common in that practice. So I was able to like harness what my what I would feel or what I would need or things I would like to have known as a child living through that experience and apply that knowledge to these letters over here in the application of skills in the front line. So I was able to like harness that really quickly and use that knowledge and that isn't stuff that they taught me, doing my Ontario risk assessment training. Right.
And the sometimes the risk in actually call it reliving or or talking about it again, I wonder, and I'm not the professional, but sometimes what people have cautioned me about in having this conversation with others is they may not have completely recovered.
Right.
So if you take them there again, they might get stuck this time. And I thought about that a lot. But then when I looked at my own experiences, I kind of approach it the same sort of way. I go, hold on a second. Nope, I'm going to go through it again. And I've probably played this in my head.
It's like a record.
1,000 times. And sometimes I do come out of it feeling a little bit, maybe the word is angry. You know, like there's this like, I was a victim at this point.
Yeah.
And there was this like, I want justice.
Yeah.
And so, but every time I play it, I get another little nugget, let's call it, or an insight.
Yeah.
So I don't feel that there's, to me, yes, there's a danger.
There is a danger.
Right.
And the thing is what we're talking about is not just belief systems, right? So there's belief systems attached to this, but we're talking about trauma, right? So when we talk about trauma looks different for everyone. And trauma is a lifelong process, right? It really is. It's a lifelong process of self-responsibility, doing the shadow work, keeping things in check. But I do agree with you, because the more, wherever they are on their spectrum of addressing their trauma, that it just gives you so much more knowledge. And the more you sit in the discomfort, the actual pain and the visceral responses and the horrors of the things you've witnessed and gone through and experienced, it's like the water. It's like you just acclimate to the waters, and you can swim in it differently.
So
it's that duality, right? You have that joy.
That part when you just said you acclimate.
Yeah.
Right there. That's what I want to talk about, that moment of acclimation. So for example, how I would actually do it, what I had to say to myself is going, come on, stop feeling sorry for yourself.
Yeah.
Right? That's the beginning of the acclimation, because that's like going from, okay,
you got to do something about this.
Yeah, this is now on me.
Yeah.
Right there. So you see how we brush over that? Like, you got to acclimate.
Yeah.
Whoa. How did you acclimate
point.
again?
So,
and how many times did you have to try and not get it right?
Yeah.
And try and try and try. And
it's
what
a lot
were the
of
different
work,
things that you did? Do you remember those things?
Yeah, I do remember those things.
So like if you were to give like a,
well, for
if you
me,
were to recall, like what would you recall?
Okay, so the first, because I didn't articulate this until I became a parent, right? So when my son was 8 months, no, he wasn't even 8 months old. I would say he was like 5 or 6 months old.
Okay.
And he's in his high chair. I was just bringing him some blueberries, and just so simple, just such an innocuous thing, but that's how trauma works, right? You're just triggered and you don't know why.
Okay.
And I don't know what triggered me in that moment still, but I was definitely triggered. So I was bringing him blueberries. I set them on his high chair, and then all of a sudden just dropped to the ground. You
just fell down.
I just fell to the ground. The abuse hit me. All of these flood of sexual abuse memories kept coming into my head, and I couldn't get myself off the ground. Like I physically couldn't get off the ground. My body was so heavy, and I was becoming dysregulated because I was scared. And then he was looking down on me and started to cry because he could see what was happening to me.
How old was he this time?
He was about 5-6 months old.
5-6 months.
And so, and this all happened. It was a matter of like minutes. It wasn't very long because I could see the clock out of my peripheral, but it was like a shift. And so I just had this like visual of like, oh, this is what this trauma feels like. And like, I could sit in this for years. Like I could see me being incapacitated for years, sitting in that despair, and how debilitating it really could be because I couldn't get off the ground. And then I just looked up at him and I'm like, you got to make a choice. And I'm like, you have to stand up and face this, or you're going to be on this ground for a long, long time. And that's what I did. And then I just stood up, and then I booked a counselor. I phoned the police. I phoned Children's Aid. I confronted my uncle. I just like went down the list of things. And so, and then you go into counseling, and you go out of counseling, and you go into therapies, and you have to constantly dig and integrate, right? It's not pretty. It's not linear. It's an emotional process. But once you go through and you get through, there's some really great therapeutic modalities to get the mind-body connection going. And when you tap into where your trauma lies in your body, you really, really tap into, like soul purpose, your spirit, or whatever your inner self. There's all these different words for it, right? So
there's something that doesn't add up to me, because I don't actually remember all of this that you just mentioned.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm not making the connection yet. So
yeah,
you're bringing blueberries to your 5-6 month old son.
Yeah.
You fall down to the ground, and then you just talked about something to do with abuse and having to take therapy.
Yeah.
Like, I don't understand. How's that all connected? And how do you connect all of that? How did that unravel?
For me, the way my brain works, I just knew what I needed to do. It just came to me. And I guess my experiential knowledge too, I knew what I needed to do as a social worker to be able to clear that out.
So you discovered at that point in time, like, the blueberries had nothing to do with it.
I think
what was it?
I don't know. So this is the thing about trauma, is like you can trigger a traumatic memory through usually sensory stimulus. It's very grounded in like your taste, your smells, scents, textures, sights.
But it obviously took you to something
took me there. Yeah.
And what was that place that it took you to?
It was the moment where I was 5 years old and I was being sexually abused.
Okay.
It took me right to that trauma.
Okay.
And that trauma kept me on the ground.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
sorry, I thought I didn't realize.
No, I didn't see the connection, and I did not understand.
And that's what it is. And so trauma it could be the most innocent thing can trigger that. Like I remember once I was in a session with this young man, and he was, very depressed, very suicidal, and I was like just going over things to try to get movement into his life again, and I said, well, what about competitive swimming? And then I could just feel it. He didn't say anything. His face didn't change, like nothing visual, nonverbal changed, but I could feel it. And then I'm just like, what happened? Mm-hmm. He's like, what do you mean what happened? I'm like, I just felt something. I said, I just was talking about competitive swimming. And I said, I just felt like this ping in my heart. Mm-hmm. And he said, and then he ran through this story of how he had a trauma related to competitive swimming. So when I said that word, it just brought him back to his trauma. Right. So he was able to identify what it was that those words brought him back. But in that moment, I didn't know if it was the blueberries. It could have been the sunlight. It could have been the paint color. It could have been a smell. Right. I don't know what brought me back.
But there it was. It took you back there.
It took me back.
So now I've had this happen to me as well. Like and it's similar. It's not like it's not the same scenario. But for me, it was always, I reach these points. Like I feel like I'm just at the edge of this glorious moment, almost like about to cross the finish line on something. Mm-hmm. For me, mm-hmm. I'm about to cross the finish line.
You got more work to do.
No, what would happen is I would fall down.
Yeah.
And I couldn't understand why this was happening. And it was not just that I would fall down. I would literally stop moving.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, there I did it again. And then there I did it again. And then that, by the way, it wasn't just my not moving. It was me looking at it going, I'm not going to make it.
Right. Because you can actually
and I couldn't
feel
understand
how you couldn't make it.
I couldn't understand why I kept saying this to myself.
Yeah.
I was like, wait a second. I got all the way here. I passed all of these hurdles.
Yeah.
All I got to do is step across the finish line. And I'm not stepping across the finish line. Why am I not doing this? And my problem was I couldn't connect it to anything. I didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my problem.
It's like change.
I couldn't understand because this kept happening again and again at different points. I'm about to cross the finish line on something. Is how I'm expressing it right now. The contexts are all very different. But then I'm about to cross the finish line on something, and I won't cross.
It wasn't right for you, yeah.
And I was thinking, what? And while I was not crossing so many other times, I didn't realize that I wasn't crossing. I was just thinking there was something circumstantial.
Work out. Yeah.
It was beyond me. But it happened enough times that I started looking at it.
That you were the one common denominator.
Yeah, that's what I started noticing. I was like, wait, it happened here, it happened here, it happened here.
Yeah.
In your case, it happened at one point and you were able to make the connection. Everything changes once you're able to make the connection, because then you got to go, that's what I got to go deal with. So you made that connection at that time. I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Is that the first time it happened to you?
That I was
That you got to that point?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was the first time.
Were there other times that you kind of felt yourself starting to fall
100%.
down?
You always live with the awareness of it and the
Like
body
you were
sensation.
5, right? And at this time you're a mom.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
So all this time went on. If
but
you
you
look
still
back,
carry it. Yeah.
Of course you carry it. Like that kind
very
of just,
real, like in a very different way than I carry it now. Now it's
right.
not activated, but at those times it was very activated for me.
So that was like the greatest level of activation you saw of it.
100%, because I couldn't get off the ground.
Did you see it building up to that point from other moments, or did it just go from nothing to this?
Like a switch.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're telling me from the time you were 5 and had gone through this trauma,
yeah,
you tucked it away,
yeah,
and that was it. It never crept up again.
It would creep up for me personally. Like
Right.
I could taste things and smell things.
Be more specific now. So like I want to start from like say 5, and maybe we're going to kind of accelerate the rate,
Yeah.
right? But here you are, like when you said that, like when did you start noticing something tasted different or whatever you just
I
said?
knew the taste of, I don't want to get really explicit, but I
Right.
knew the taste of certain things connected to sexual activity.
Okay.
And I could just be like walking around in my day and then the taste comes into my mouth.
Huh.
Or I taste it. Or if I was engaging in sexual activity, then I'd be transported back.
Okay.
So sometimes you're engaging in sexual activity. Sometimes you're just a smell or a scent just comes back into your brain and it's like you're there in that moment. But the scent is even happening in the world that you're in. Like you're not like
right.
around it. It's like being able to smell, roses, and the roses are like 4 rooms over. There's no physical way you could actually smell it, but you still have that really
and
real
while that's all
activation.
going on inside of you, you're continuing to grow as a person.
I was a competitive gymnast, a
getting
competitive
all of these
swimmer.
things
I was
happening.
on honor rolls. I was like, yeah.
You're on your way to something, but there's this thing.
Yeah.
That's slowly.
But I also had the duality too, right? I was
Mm.
a super high achiever,
Mm.
but I also was like into like, I was like such a daredevil and took all these calculated risks, or some of them just like stupid risks.
Right.
Right. You're always, there was that duality in my experience.
And it's
too.
how you were carrying this trauma.
Right. And so like you develop maladaptive and adaptive coping mechanisms. And that was just one trauma. I've had multiple, right?
So when you say adaptive and maladaptive, give me an example.
Okay. So an adaptive strategy during...
Because we're smarter than we realize, right? A 100%. Lot of people. And just that.
Yeah.
And you're even smarter because you understand the technique now.
Yeah.
But so tell me. So give me examples of adaptive and maladaptive things.
So an adaptive strategy for that sexual assault when I was younger would be to like zone out, go into my head, create a space, and just kind of like tune out of my body a little bit, right?
Okay.
That's a very adaptive response.
And you would do this like you would sit down and go, now I'm going to do this.
It just happens
It would be
naturally.
nothing
the brain does it to protect you.
To kind of prompt you.
Yeah, your brain does it naturally to protect you. Everyone has this capacity.
Okay.
When something is too overwhelming for us, we
just
can put it in a little box and just kind of disassociate, right? It's a disassociation. So in that context, it's very adaptive, right? Because that's like a survival skill when that's happening, right?
Got it.
Because you can't control what's happening to you, but you can control your response, right? So you develop this adaptive skill, but then later on, that same adaptive skill, it becomes hardwired into your brain. And so we all have this, whether it be experiences or traumas. And so these adaptive skills become hardwired, but then they sometimes become maladaptive in our life. So while this disassociation or compartmentalizing became adaptive in that context, it became maladaptive later in life, particularly like when, let's say, I became sexually active. This is just one example of
right. That's what I wanted to know. I
wanted
to see like okay.
So where it
real.
becomes adaptive to maladaptive. So becomes sexually active. And I could never find my voice. I could never say, no, I don't want to do that. Or I would just retreat into my head anytime I would engage in any kind of sexual activity and disassociate. Right? Because that's what I did with sex or sexual activity during assaults when I was younger.
I see.
Right? So that was an adaptive strategy. But in the context of healthy reciprocal relationships, that's a very maladaptive thing to do because you're not connecting with your partner. You're not saying what your needs are. Your needs aren't getting met, or your comfort level might not be expressed. So you might be engaging in things that are not comfortable, but you can't.
And while you were going through this maladaptive
voice.
And adaptive behavior, did you at that time make the connection? Were you even aware? Would you say, looking back
not
on
initially,
it, that it was connected? You're not even aware.
No, because I
so
was
imagine how many
very
people
young.
are not.
Of course.
So we have
this is the thing. No one talks about this stuff.
Right.
Right. Because
so this could be happening.
It's happening to all of us. We
don't
have
even
these things.
We haven't even connected it.
Right. Because these conversations are very faux pas.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Right. Particularly around like sexual abuse. No one wants to talk about sexual abuse.
Right.
But it's like one of the most prevalent things.
Or even abuse of any sort.
Any abuse, yeah.
Absolutely.
100%.
And that's even more prevalent, like how abusive, certain environments or relationships can be.
Yeah.
There's just no shortage of it. And here are people then walking through life, not realizing that we are now at these, what I would call near my finish lines.
Right.
And not getting across.
Right.
And I'm not able to make that connection.
Right. And so when you look at
how did you finally start? Like, so you had this moment coming back to the blueberries. I'm going to call it the blueberry.
the blueberry incident.
So the blueberry incident, that's when you knew.
Well, it's not, I knew, I've always known, but that's when I knew if I didn't deal with this, I would be on that floor.
Okay. So it got to
So
this
I knew
point.
that, and I looked up at my son and I'm like, you're a mother now. You got to like get rid of this shit because he's the priority.
Yeah.
And you can't barf this negativity onto this little boy's life.
So I find that interesting.
Because I'm not responsible for what happened to me. I'm not responsible for that abuse, but I am responsible for how it manifests in my life and how I receive and perceive information and how I carry myself in my relationships.
Do you think
it was a self-responsibility moment.
Well, that's interesting because I was just about to ask you, speaking of responsibility, and I'm just, again, this is from a complete layman's point of view. All these other times, there wasn't a son that you had to look at and say, if I don't get my shit together, right? Before it was just you.
Yeah.
And now there's this other sort of, this other person who's got a lot of meaning, or this other sort of responsibility that we have. And all of a sudden it was like this commitment that we had to that.
Right.
That
superseded a commitment to self.
Do you think that had anything to do with it?
That's trauma as well, right?
Okay.
So that's also a trauma response in the sense that someone else's needs are more important than my own.
Right.
But I knew that, but I didn't give a shit because it motivated me to get off the floor, right? And so what I did is I just kept that awareness.
Okay.
And I'm like, okay, I gotta unpack this because at that moment, not that I was suicidal or I didn't care about myself or I wasn't depressed. There wasn't anything like that.
Right.
But I had more care and love and vigor to do well for my son than I did for myself. Right. And so that's also a trauma response. My needs are less, yours are more. I'll put my needs down and so forth. But
it's interesting because that's similar to what happened here. In my case, it was the same sort of motivation. Right. And one of the things we try to talk about is, being enabled, empowered, but then being motivated.
Right.
Like, what's my why? And I was thinking, you're a father now. You got these kids,
depend on you.
Somehow that pushed, and it was like it gave me a reason. And even if it meant it wasn't that myself that I was doing this for, I was doing it for them.
Yeah.
It was leverage. And I think that's something that you can take a closer look at.
Right.
Because everybody can maybe find that leverage. Is that
Everyone
what you would call it?
Everyone has something that motivates, something that connects them. So like when you're looking at things through, when you do assist training, assist is applied suicide intervention skills training. So when you're doing assist training, when you're trying to literally talk someone off the roof, it's about what are they connected to?
Okay.
Right? What motivates them to stay alive? What motivates you to work through this discomfort? And so it's the connection that's key. And so a suicidal person or a person in the depths of despair of whatever their experience is that they're going through, that motivation and that connection isn't going to come from the self because you're so depleted at that point. So you need to find baselines to connect people to.
Because usually on the way to that point, to that abyss point,
yeah,
you know how you talked about getting this something that you connected to? Usually, and I found that I was cutting my connections
Right.
to the things that would actually be my motivators later. And that's what created the despair now, ultimately.
From the lack of
not
connection.
suicidal. I was completely disconnected from all my motivations.
Yeah.
And I was the one cutting them. I also realized. And in fact, what I also realized is even these elements of abuse that were around me were part of an ecosystem that I was responsible for creating,
Right.
almost to keep me there.
Yep.
And then when I finally realized that this is my creation,
Right.
then I was like, wait, if I can create it, then I can create something else.
Mm-hmm. We're willing participants in our own incarceration.
This is it. So
in every step of our way, we make these informed decisions that set up our structures of our life, but are not resonating with who we are as people.
So you finally got to this point of owning it and saying, I have to do something for whatever the reasons are.
Yeah.
And then after that point, it looks like, okay, I'm going to do this, whether talk to somebody or do something. But right up until that point, it was like, I felt, I don't know if you felt, putting it under the rug.
Yeah, straight
That's exactly it.
Putting it under the rug, yeah.
Until there was just no more rug.
No more rug. The rug
The
had
rug
a big
got pulled
mound
out. The rug got pulled
dirt
out from underneath our feet, literally, and we're finding ourselves on the floor.
Yeah.
I think that's, to me, like where the real, the aha moments, what do they call those? Anyway,
epiphanies.
Those epiphanies, right? They take place.
Yeah.
Right? Because up until that moment, I didn't know why. I did know why, and it just wasn't enough to go and do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
You and I feel like sometimes got lucky, because a lot of times when we fall down there, we just stay down there. And it can actually happen.
Yeah.
Like you got a little bit of tenacity in you.
Yeah.
You were a competitive, you said, was it swimmer or gymnast?
Gymnast and swimmer,
okay.
Yeah.
So you had this competitive side
I'm
of
a Scorpio.
You're a Scorpio. So you got you got the attitude.
Yeah,
You're sassy.
A little bit of fire.
Yeah, you got a little fire.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's interesting. I'm an Aries, so it's a hard head. Like people say that. So I got a little bit of attitude.
The Ram. I think that's Ram.
Yeah. My name is Muhammad Ali. I was named after this guy. He was like, super attitude, right? So that attitude we had, as much as it can be a weakness in some ways, it became, a tool for us that we can pull out. And I worry about situations where people didn't have that. So I'll come back to that another time. What do you do when when you don't? But I don't want you to get into that, because that's somebody else's.
Those are resiliency factors, and everyone's resiliency factors look different, right?
So your resiliency that's it. So that's what picked you back up. How hard was it though for you? I mean, after that moment, it's not like, okay, it's then roses after that. You still had to go.
Yeah, I still did it.
Right.
But I don't know. And again, this is part of the disassociation too. You can just and it's maybe an alpha kind of personality too. I'm just I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to get it done. And I did. I literally.
Did you think, for example, that it was that was a one-time thing? It's not going to happen.
No, I knew it. I've gone back to therapy at different points over my son's 18 now.
Okay.
So I've gone back and done different work, stuff percolates.
Okay.
Right. And surfaces still. Right.
So what were the discoveries that you that's cool that he's 18 now. He was 5 months old.
Yeah.
You said you did different sort of sessions.
Yeah.
Walk us through some of the discoveries that you can share, right? That you feel comfortable sharing. So
at the beginning,
you find out?
It was just really
How did you come over it?
It was really just about identifying what happened to me, saying it out loud, because I'd never said it out loud to anyone.
That was the first and earliest sessions. Right?
The very first sessions is the first time I ever actually, when I got myself off the floor, I phoned my boss at CAS. I worked at Children's Aid at the time, and I told her what had just happened to me. And I said, I'm going to go to counseling. And what do you think? What do you think I should do? Or who should I go to?
Right.
And she wasn't surprised, because her feedback, I can't remember her verbatim, but her feedback was, Triena, I'm not surprised. Look at the investigations you do and how well you do them.
Wow.
She knew by the nature of my work, I had insight. And also from the fact that I'd work crazy overtime, obscene amount of overtime, right? So so she was the first person I said it to. Then I went to counseling, then really unpack the whole story and what it looked like, and into the grooming and so forth, and how long it went on for.
So these are different sessions.
These are different sessions.
About?
I did it for about 3 months. I went once a week for 3 months. And then at the end of that 3 months, I confronted my uncle, who was the perpetrator of the abuse. I had a friend sitting in a coffee shop in the peripheral that he didn't know, just to make sure I was, okay.
So you had to kind of plan the logistics on this, right?
Yep.
These are not accidental small little details. They're important.
Yeah, I guess so.
Well,
I haven't thought about it in so long.
When you think about it, because like a lot of times we do this.
Right.
We plan. We then execute, and that's the kind of stuff that I want to share.
Yeah, is the details of the growth.
Yeah,
right?
because in there is where I think sometimes I've made missteps. Maybe in the past, you've even maybe tried to confront or you've tried to correct, but those are the details that were not present. Right. There was no safety net, for example, when you were setting it up the first time. So then you didn't end up doing it, right?
Yeah.
Unbeknowingly, right? So go on, you were saying.
Yeah, so I just set up for him to meet me at a local restaurant. My friend was there. She knew what was up.
Within just 3 months?
Within 3 months.
Huh.
And confronted him, told him like one memory in great detail.
Yeah.
And he didn't, and this is the beauty of it, he didn't say no and he didn't say yes. He just said, Triena, if you believe that happened, I'm sorry, you're going through this. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just like, that to me, that was affirmation, because coming from working a lot within the field, I know, he wasn't going to make an inculpatory statement, but an innocent person would deny. Not that I had any, I knew he did it.
Well, the thing that I take from that,
innocent people will be like, are you insane? Are you kidding me?
Right.
Whatever. So the fact that it was just, that was validating for me in that sense. Right.
That's the interesting thing is that quite often when others are doing the same sort of thing and they're trying to approach it the same way, they don't get that confession.
Right.
And because they didn't get it, I think that's what we seek is we're like, hey, I want you to understand.
You need to be accountable.
You did this as well.
Yeah.
Right.
But you don't need that.
So you don't need it.
Yeah. And, I did it just because I felt like that was something I need to do. I have a massive family. A lot of people didn't talk to me after that. I was, ostracized and still am, which is fine.
Right.
And that's the thing. Like, you have to shift into forgiveness, because it's not forgiveness for them, it's forgiveness for yourself. Because if you can't forgive, it just harbors resentment, and it's like a cancer in your body. So I had to have that conversation with him to say, you know what, I forgive you for this, because I do understand. I know some of his story, and I do understand why he does the things he does, and I don't know if he does them still, but I understood his perspective as the abuser as well. But
do you think you just skipped over this part here, and I look over and I go, hold on,
the forgiveness?
No, the being ostracized by the family.
Yeah,
and that's sometimes a risk, right?
100%.
That's sometimes a price that's for some people too high to pay. And so somebody will say, hey, you know what? I will deal with this family member. And that's often where it happens, by the way, right? It happens right close to.
It's always someone close to you. It's not the guy in the trench coat walking in the park naked, flashing people. They're people who are connected to you. They're the people that have
and so you worry about all the other
Yeah.
people that are connected to these people that are also connected to you. And if you rock that boat, God forbid, you break all these ties.
Right.
So just keep the peace.
Right.
And that makes the situation so much worse as well.
For the
So
it
you
can
went
for the person who's the victim. For
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's sometimes even something that could prolong your getting to this
Yeah,
point.
it totally could. And I kind of like, and this is the thing with me with therapy, I kind of leapfrog over things because I can get through a lot of stuff on my own, like through meditation and reflection and just really, practicing gratitude and really holding myself accountable for my actions.
Because a lot of times for those who go through this, and again, I will speak also from my own experience, is that when that reaction comes from the family or from the ones nearby, it seems to be taken as like, that was a misstep.
Well, yeah, because it's
On my
interpreted
side,
as what it is.
Well, I made a mistake there then.
Right. It's shutting down the victim, right? Because people are so uncomfortable with the truth that you're speaking. They would rather you be quiet than for them to face that reality, because the disruption it causes within themselves and their relationship with the perpetrator and also within the family structure, right? So
But you couldn't have another blueberry moment.
I couldn't.
Right.
It wasn't worth it to me.
Right.
It wasn't worth it. So
it's blueberries.
You know,
blueberries.
it's sad at times, you know, because, you know, you'd think people would keep you in their circle, but, you know, that's their journey and that's a reflection of them. That's not a reflection of me. You know, you just send them love from a distance because they will matriculate back. Like I remember in the last couple of years, my dad's just even come to because this was his sibling.
Yeah.
And so I guess, okay, so he was 18, about 3 years. So I was 50. So 15 years after I told my parents that this had happened, he, up in the first 5 to 8 years, I can't remember how long, it was a long time, he would still go on motorcycle trips with his uncle. He would stay with him, go to these picnics, like all of these different activities where they were still really engaging. And my friends were so mad. They're like, how can you even talk to your dad after you told him what he did to you? He's still hanging out with your uncle. Like, you know, I'm so pissed off and so mad for you. And I'm like,
these are not family members. These are people who
these
just
are
care
my
for
friends
you.
that care for me, right? And they're like, your dad is still hanging out with this guy, his brother, who did this to you, and you told him this. I'm like, yeah, I get it, but like, I'm okay. Like he is him. I'm me. And I'm okay no matter what.
That had no effect on you in terms of somebody siding with the other side.
It was, yeah, it did for like an hour.
Yeah.
And then I went through this wave.
Okay.
Right. And I'm like, and then as I rode that wave of discomfort and anger and, you know, like raging.
Right.
And then I just wrote it, meditated it. And I'm like, okay, that's his journey, not mine.
You meditated.
Yeah.
Okay. So you didn't just get through this, because if you don't take some of these steps.
You have to take steps to sit back and sit with it.
Right.
Right.
Let's talk about that meditating that you would do. Like, when did you decide, hey, were you doing it all the time? When did you decide, okay, this is what I want to do? Because it's a huge
so at that time I was actively meditating, and not as much as I am now. But I would say more when I was in discomfort than anything else. So now it's more of a habit that I do it good or bad.
Right.
That's my
it's part
practice.
of the routine, right?
Right. Then it was when my system is so overwhelmed and I have so many emotions and I'm just like really, you know, the Scorpio fiery version of myself comes out.
That's the thing, right?
Yeah.
That person meditating, wow, that's even harder.
Because you gotta hone it in.
Right.
And so, you know, and then I'm like, that's my dad's journey. And I had to, you know, I had to look at it from his perspective. This is his brother. You know, there's a level of cognitive dissonance that happens for people. They can't negotiate the horror that you're telling them with the person that they see, right? Because, you know, he was kind and he was generous, and this is my perpetrator, my abuser. You know, he was all these things, but that's what groomers do, right? They are these enticing, fun to be around people, right? So people can't, you know, they have that cognitive dissonance. They can't compare the two. They can't exist at the same time, right? They have to be existing in polarity for them, not in one entity as one person. So I'm just like, Dad's going to figure it out. And then about 3 years ago, that's when he started to get angry because he's like, you're never invited to the family picnic and it's been going on. I'm like, dude, I haven't been going to the family picnic for 15 years. Like all of a sudden he's like, you're going to the family picnic. I'm like, I'm okay. I'm like, and so he was having that reaction to it, right? So that was his journey in a reaction to my abuse, right? So
after having gone through all of this, right, and having come through it, and you talked about it's not something that just happened overnight. Like you work at it, you
always are working at it.
Did you find that there were times that as you were going forward, this happens to me too sometimes, it's like, I feel like I'm going forward. You know, you're making progress. You can tell.
Yeah.
Your feelings, your thoughts are different. Confidence picks up. All these things happen. Things start working out differently. But then sometimes we fall back again. Did that ever happen where you felt like you're falling
within the
back?
context of this experience? Yeah. I don't really see it as falling back. I never like those words don't really come to me. I would see it as I got to pay attention to this a little bit more right now. Right. I see this percolating a different issue for me potentially, or if I wanted to rule things out.
How would that manifest?
So for me with the chronic pain journey.
Okay. So it would appear that way.
Right. So there's a huge, this is common knowledge. There's huge schools of research about how the body will hold traumatic experiences in the myofascial tissue.
Yes.
And it actually there's an epigenetic component of cross-generational trauma. So trauma has the capacity to change our genetic profile. So I'm very aware of these things. And I read about these things all the time. So going through my experience with chronic pain and chronic migraines, I'm like, that was a pretty significant.
So they're indicators. Then.
Right. And plus, when you look at the ACEs score, like the adverse childhood experiences, my score 7 out of 10.
I don't even know what that means.
So it's a trauma, just a quick and dirty little assessment tool, because what happens, it's not diagnostic,
right,
but it's just a clinical tool. So there's 10 questions, and each question is worth 1 point. So mine was 7 out of 10. And so
kind of tells you how happy you were as a kid. Is that
it tells you about adverse experiences in your childhood. So are your parents divorced? Were you sexually assaulted? Has there been violence in your home? Has anyone had an addiction? Has anyone been incarcerated?
And is like 10 better or is 1 better?
0 is optimal.
0 is optimal. Okay.
0 is like,
all right,
you've had no adverse experiences through this lens, this perspective.
Right. Okay.
So
you're 7. That's like
pretty high.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at that, you also have to compound it and balance it with your resiliency factors as well, which I was also very resourceful at. Right. I was very resourceful at attaching. I knew the right people to attach myself to outside of my family. I just understood that as a child.
Come on.
I just knew how to connect.
What was
myself.
it about these people that told you that this is where I need to? This is who I should connect
Okay,
with?
so I'm going to go back to. I'll go to that, but I'm going to finish the ACEs score. So the ACEs is important because if you have these experiences, the research used to say 5 years, but now it's coming up more 7 years with brain development, right? Okay. So if you have several adverse experiences under the age of 5 or under the age of 7 now. Mm-hmm. That will hardwire your brain and your behaviors a certain way. So if you came out of, a very stable, very comfortable, highly nurtured household for your first 7 years of your life, and didn't experience any trauma, the chances are later in life when traumatic things, because they happen to all of us, when they do occur, you're going to have a more solid foundation to navigate that because you have a very secure attachment to start from. Okay. Right?
Got it. Yes.
You're really grounded. So most of not all, but a good chunk of my adverse experiences happened in those 7 years.
Okay.
So when that happens, it hardwires your brain differently. It hardwires your fight, flight, flee responses. It changes like we spoke about before, your adaptive and maladaptive, right? So that's how that manifests. Okay, circling back to your other question, what was it? Do you remember?
Yeah, how did you know about these people? What is it about them?
I don't know. I have a sense. I could just feel people who, which is weird for a person who's been abused, but I do feel people who can be helpful to me.
Well, if you know the people that can be hurtful, it can also tell you who can be helpful, right? Don't you think?
Yeah, and you're right. The duality, right? There's the duality of it, and so I always would have like
I would do it by saying like that one looks like the opposite of this person, so therefore, is that what you like? I don't know.
I don't remember that linear kind of thought process, but like. I
had to keep it simple, so I didn't have these references.
And I moved out really young, but
you got a feeling from these people.
Yeah, and so I would attach myself to families. Like I would rent a room. I could easily go get my own apartment at 16 when I moved out, or 15. But CIS wouldn't have let me at 15, so when I turned 16. But I would attach myself to families, and I would rent rooms off of my friends' parents.
Okay.
So I would always have like a familial structure around me, even though I was kind of like freewheeling it on my own.
But you were building these kind of tribes, this kind of support people. You talked about the village, right?
Right.
Build your village, your community.
Exactly.
Interesting.
So I have.
And while you were doing that, did you know that you were doing this, or you were just seeking it out like in tactical ways?
I didn't do it cognitively. Like I wasn't very conscious of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it turned out to be huge. In terms of its
well,
help.
some of it was conscious to be, now that I think back, because a lot of wild things happened in high school, and I came from an area. Well, I went to 3 high schools, but the area I went to high school a lot of drugs, a lot of partying,
Sure.
a lot of truancy.
Right.
And I didn't want my apartment, because I'd be by myself. I didn't want an apartment I was in to be a haven for drop-ins. Right. I didn't want that, because I knew I needed to study and work and all that kind of stuff. So I think I was very aware of that. So I did attach myself to families with that awareness of from that perspective.
So where are you today? Like with like how do you, as you look kind of like through all of this, right?
Yeah.
And you know, at some point in time, you talked about your supervisor telling you, yeah, no wonder, you know, these are the kind of cases that you're taking. Do you now, as you look back on all this, I mean, there's a lot, right? Obviously, that you're looking back on.
Yeah.
Look at what you are today, though. I mean, look at what you're able to do for, right?
Yeah.
For others, kind of who are going through these sort of. Would you say that you'd even be anywhere as, again, I don't know what the technical word would be for it, but you know, as effective as you are today, had you not really seen it to like that level of proximity to the trauma, you know, as you're helping people who go through trauma? I find that like for me, it was in business, right? Like for me, it was like I kept falling down. And now when I see people falling down in business, you talk to people on a personal level, you know, I talk to people on a business level, and I think, yeah, hey, oh, that, oh yeah, you know, don't worry, it gets worse and then it gets better. That's what I say, and we laugh it off and off we go. But deep down inside, you know that you're not joking about it.
Right.
It can get pretty bad, but don't worry.
Right.
You know, there's a way out of this, and you're perfectly capable right the way you are right now to get through it. You just need a few tips, and then you work from there, right?
Right.
You're so much more effective now doing that.
Yeah. Like I think there's a lot of people in helping professions that haven't been through the traumatic experiences that I have that would be just as helpful and skilled or more skilled than I would be, right? I do believe there is that segment, but I feel like, you know, I don't do self-disclosure when I'm working with people, right? Because it's not about me, it's about them.
Of course.
But you have these moments where you're like, oh, okay, well, this is like with my experience, this is where I would have probed a little differently, or would have appreciated this line of questioning, or this type of engagement. And so I use that information to navigate, but there's no disclosure attached to it, right? But I think the thing of it is with what my experiences have been, and this is a risk with anyone in any helping professional, and myself included, is if I'm not aware of my trauma and I'm not looking at it regularly, and I'm not aware of how it is manifesting in my actions and interactions with others, may it be my clients or my family members, friends, whoever I'm working with, but most importantly, and for this conversation, my clients, because that's who I'm their helper, right? If I'm not aware of my trauma, then I could be traumatizing them. So it comes to the responsibility, like it's that self-responsibility where I need to perpetually be doing this kind of like, you know, cleansing and checking and rebalancing and figuring out where I am, and that self-accountability, because, you know, we all have trauma and it comes out in different ways. And so when you're in a helping profession, you have to be very aware of what you're bringing to the table and why you're bringing certain things to the table. Yeah. So something as innocuous as billing, you know, if you have discomfort, and this was an issue for me initially, is, you know, I discomfort with billing people. You know, I don't like charging for what I do because it's a passion, but I got to eat. Right. Right. So, you know, and I was really hesitant. This person was, you know, grossly arrears in their account with me. And I contributed to, like, I consented to this, like it was a conversation, but now it was like, we needed to be dealt with. Right. And there was a hesitancy there. And so I had to sit with that for a while. I'm like, hey, why am I hesitant? Yeah. Why? Like, I've provided a service. Right. We have a contract. Right. Where's the disconnect? Right. 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 And so I had to work through, like, where's that coming from? Right. And a trauma associated with money. Right. So then then I had to, like, come into the conversation first and at the meeting, because I knew if I didn't address that at the very beginning of the meeting and left it to the very end after the end of the session and just said, oh, by the way, let's clean up the arrears, that's putting my needs first, not his needs first. Right? Because that's an uncomfortable situation for me to have that discussion.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And it's easier for me to do at the end when it's quick and dirty and like, oh, I got another client in 5 minutes. You got to go. So just write me a check. No, I had to put it at the beginning because I'm there for him. And my needs don't matter necessarily, like for lack of a better word in that moment. Right. So
there are so many people who, as you said, there's no shortage of examples where people go through cases of abuse. There could have been like other parallel lives for you, like other paths you could have taken, had you not done certain things. You know, and sometimes
I was on both paths, the good and the bad, simultaneously.
So that's an interesting thought, because we're constantly journeying anyway.
Yeah.
So like again, sometimes we shift lanes, right?
Right.
But here you are, and you're doing great, and you know there are all these others that maybe either weren't aware of the other, you know, that other parallel, that other lane, right? They can't make that shift. They're not making that shift for whatever reason. Either they don't have the tribe, they don't have the motivators, or they're not aware of their motivators. There's so many sort of things that kind of hold people in that position.
And all or nothing thinking.
Okay, so what do you say to that person to get them to take that next sort of steps? It could be one or two things that you look at and go, hey, yeah, these are probably one of the biggest things that were holding me, and this right there is what I would start thinking about doing differently. I mean, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again,
expecting a different result,
right?
Yeah.
So what is that thing? What is that one or two things that people could take away from that?
To try to get them
if
motivated?
You were to go back to Triena, not at the time of the blueberries, before that, right? Because you want to say like to you as blueberries, you falling down in front of your five-month-old. Somebody else, that's another moment, right? And you're able at that moment to say pick up the phone and see the time and see all these things. But for others,
I could totally see in that moment how people are they could get lost into it.
It's debilitating. You break down.
I could see.
And you can't just hit a reset button and take a time out
and that's where I have some
water.
Kind of resiliency factor that just kicks in. I have some kind of.
So as you see people kind of building up to that moment, what could be done? I guess is my question is, if you were to talk to Triena before that moment, going, hey, you didn't have to get to this point. Here's a thought. Here's one or two things that you could do that you think about that could, like you said, leapfrog you past that moment. You don't have to wait till you get to that. Is there anything?
I do hear what you're saying, but I see it from two different perspectives. I see it from the perspective of trauma, and I see it through the perspective of just going through life challenges that are really shitty, and how do you get up from that?
Sure.
Right.
Yes.
So from the perspective of trauma is, earlier intervention can be helpful from a clinical perspective, but I never said anything. So my loss of connection happened long before the abuse happened, because I didn't feel safe enough to even say anything to my parents. I never told them.
Okay.
Right. So when you're looking at it, dealing with traumas, we tend to look at things in a very linear fashion. Trauma isn't linear. It's messy. It's sporadic. It's, snaky and squirrely and meandering. And it's a lifelong journey, right? We're always reflecting and keeping things in check and just seeing where things are at, right? So to say there's one kind of trajectory to unfold that is, we can't really put that approach because it's so unique to every person, and every person has their own resiliency factors and strengths and readiness to come to the table to face these realities, right? And then, so when you're looking at it from the perspective of just hitting milestones that are really hard and where you're getting into the darkness and the dirt of life and just like remove trauma from the equation, I think from that perspective, I think knowing your essence, knowing who you are, what your values are, what your beliefs are, and really getting a foundational grounding in that, and being told that it's okay. Like we have this such adverse reaction to anything that's uncomfortable or painful in life. And we're not taught that, with pain, like coming back to what we talked about earlier with the analogy of the butterfly, with growth comes struggle. Right. And we're not taught that. We're taught like, let's soothe things. Let's take an Advil. Let's take the easy way. Like, oh, you got money. You got this handed to you. Like, pointing externally all the time. But I think if we're taught earlier to look internally, to connect with ourselves, to meditate, and really, really align with what really manifest what aligns with us. I think if we're taught those capacities earlier on, and how to take care of ourselves properly, and how to communicate effectively, and how to have relationships, I think those are the pivotal things I think would have been super helpful, because I think we all learn those things whether we're unpacking trauma or not.
So
right?
Keep inflecting and keep communicating.
Yeah.
Somebody said it the other day. We were talking about, you can't help fill up another person's cup unless your cup is full, or something like that. Somebody was talking about the cup.
It's like the airplane. Put your mask on first, right?
So I thought about that, and I got to moments myself where it really felt the cup was completely empty.
Yeah.
And then and now I keep telling myself, the one thing I tell myself is like, I'm going to get to those moments again where I'm going to feel the cup is empty. And on that day, remind yourself that actually you have a lot in that cup that's worth fighting for. Because we forget, or we lose sight of, right? And sometimes we feel like it's external to us. We got to go get something. There's not enough inside of us that we're not capable enough, or that we're not worth it.
The negative self-talk comes in. The ego comes in. Yep.
And that gets you through.
Yeah.
Whew. You know what? I got to say, what you have that I think will be very helpful when we're meeting and talking to other people and having conversations is that, sometimes you shout out these terminologies that I'm looking at it going, wow, that's just like, you so understand this. And I can't decipher whether you understand it because you've been through it or because you studied it.
Both.
Yeah. I think that's what makes you so great at it. So thank you, just for sitting here chatting with me about it. And I could just see us quite often sitting together with somebody else and just being able to, walk people through. Yeah. It's going to be a little bit uncomfortable for people, but I really appreciate that you're willing to do something that I think is very uncomfortable for people to do. And you're proving, this is, I think, the biggest thing that I admire about you, is that some would look at it as uncomfortable. Some of them look at it as risky. Mm-hmm. You look at it as
it's truth.
Yeah. I love that.
It's truth.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And we're going to do this again.
Let's do it again.
All right.
We
Sounds
can
like a
talk
plan.
all day.
Sounds like a plan. I have some other ideas we're going to talk about.
Oh, God.
All right. And I think, I don't know, that sounds like a wrap.